didn't bother me. I said, I know myself. My theory must be wrong. Problem is the theory looks like it wasn't wrong. And that is the pattern of the brain. And they said, we want to talk to you afterwards. So I met them afterwards at the president, rector of the University of Oslo in Norway, with all these psychiatrists there. They said, you're probably a psychopath. You don't even know it.
Dr. James Fallon, thank you for joining me on the show.
Hi, Zach. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you too.
Where are you sitting?
Where am I based? Sitting?
Yeah,
I'm in Brooklyn, New York.
Right. It's where my family's from.
Your family's from Brooklyn?
My mother's and my father's side, the Sicilian side of were loaded back there, and I still have family. Nieces and nephews that live back there, and people in the film industry that do a lot of shooting in Brooklyn and Manhattan. So I'm not from there. My family is. My brother did a lot of off Broadway stuff.
Yeah.
Back there in the 70s and 80s, he acted back there, and so.
Yeah, I'm in Park Slope, and I imagine, since your family, it sounds like they've been there for a long time. I imagine the Park Slope and Brooklyn that I know looks, completely different from the Brooklyn that they know back then. Because I hear stories from people who've been in Park Slope for the last 20, 30 years, shop owners that have stuck around, a few veterans, and it was super dangerous in Park Slope, which is the complete opposite. Now it's like known as the bougie part of Brooklyn, but back in the day, things were popping off.
My grandfather used to, he ran numbers, and he had a grocery business and made beer and wine way back then, and they lived on Atlantic. And my grandfather, on the other side of my family, on the civilian side, the non-Sicilian side, lived on Western, right near you, a couple of blocks from where you are right now.
Oh yeah. I'm about a mile from the Barclays Center, so a mile south of Atlantic.
Yeah,
so right there.
Very close to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's funny because you're telling me about your family, and I just got done reading The Psychopath Inside, which is your book. I have it right here. And You go into great detail about your family history, a lot of past, party times with friends, incidents, things that happened. So in a way, I feel like I already know a bit about your life and what you've been through, and I just want to say that it's such a great book because the science is dumbed down enough for someone like me to be able to understand it, but then the way that it's tied together with the storytelling and the experiences, it all meshes as this concise narrative that was very easy to go through. It was hard to put it down.
Well, great. I'm happy to hear that, because for some people it's not that way. It's, of course, for my friends who are scientists, I had a version of the book that was much longer, and the people, the psychiatrists who know me well, and the scientists, I said I gotta take out 80 pages, and when they saw the 80 pages I took out, they flipped. And working with my New York agent, and she was great. I just heard from her that the book is in about 12 languages now. It's now, we just got contacted by from Vietnam. They want to put it in Vietnamese. It's in Chinese and everything.
Wow.
So that's great. And I do a lot of talks and podcasts, etc.
What
in
made
Asia,
them?
the Middle.
What made your colleagues flip about the 80 pages that got taken out? What was the majority of that
the
section?
most relevant pieces I had taken out that were what they thought were the most interesting. These are scientists and psychiatrists who know me well.
So there's a lot of science related things that got taken out in place of the stories.
Yeah, it was the crazier stories. I mean, the little bit more embarrassing stories that, as my one daughter says, it gets a little cringy. Some of these things get a little cringy after a
Yeah.
while, and she knows a lot of psychology. But my the kids and my grandkids love it because it's for Gramps to be like a little kooky. That's it's great fun for them, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah. It's weird. Cringe is now this, modern day insult that makes people, if you're, if you're in a friend group that's, I feel like more high school, college, if someone calls you cringe, then it's more of a cause for concern because you feel more like an outcast. But I mean, I feel old and I'm 29. I've been, kind of out of that culture for a while now. So if someone calls me, if someone calls me cringe, I know what it is, but I don't care nearly as much as if I was 19 years old, sophomore in college, and someone was like, "Oh my God, that's cringy." I would be walking around for 2 weeks feeling like an outsider, questioning everything I do because one person called me cringe.
I got to ask my daughter about that because
Yeah.
and my the grandkids because I mean it's just like she thinks it's like too revealing.
Hmm.
It gets too much. It's letting people too much inside my head, sort of thing. It doesn't bother me,
Is
but
there is there a story from that 80 pages that you wish you could have included in the book or you would have?
well, my agent, who ended up getting it published widely, she just said it was too weird.
Was there a
If,
story that comes to mind particular that was too weird?
well, there was all sorts of stuff
Hmm.
on clairvoyance and things like that, and the nature of those things that were
Mm.
just too strange for she said her audience. I mean she and her audience and her people, the people like on the View. So she was looking forward to what I would be saying on shows where she had connections and people
Mm.
she knows. I think it was more like what her perception of how the reaction would be from her people. She's a publisher, so an agent, and but there were things that were a little too strange for them that my colleagues thought were very much relevant,
So
especially the psychiatry.
so those things were too kooky to align with the science that you were presenting in the book, or your agent was worried that it would be just too in outer space for people to take the rest of the book seriously?
Yeah, like that.
Okay.
Was because if you start talking about you know things about different levels of consciousness and dualities in the brain like that, it can be a bit overwhelming and too weird. So it was like, well, if you're saying that, then maybe the other stuff is like crazy. But it didn't bother me. I mean, so she just told me, my agent. She just says, write another book. I said that would be a divorce.
Yeah.
But
Wh-
there are more things. There are more like the background in our family uh, is has more murderers in it and more recent murderers, and so that's a different twist than when I was writing it because now the whole thing about crime is much bigger now than it was 12 years ago.
Yeah, there's
All
the whole the true crime
true crime
pipeline of
stuff.
society on Netflix, YouTube, podcast that wasn't here 10, even 5 years ago. Now everything
That's right.
is a different serial killer, a different haunting story. It's become monetized to the point where if there's not some true crime element to it, people try to create one. And sometimes you watch these documentaries and it's marketed as a true crime documentary, but it's more just a story that has true crime on the periphery, and it's not actually
Yeah.
part of the story at all. So it's become this whole big thing now.
I I'd done some interviews with CNN, and I just had a Fox film crew here on serial killers, children of serial killers, and how that could happen. That is it possible to pass down this stuff, right?
Mm.
And there's a whole thing on epigenetics, which is something that could have happened to your grandfather or grandmother that really gets passed down to you. So that's there's a whole science to that that's quite interesting, and so it stays interesting, and so for people who think that they're channeling somebody from the past, and in a way, of course, you would say, well, I'm living some other life. Let's say Jane Roberts or something, so you're a medium that's channeling some. Well, in a sense, your brain is doing that, and your genes are. You're inheriting those genes and those brain circuits that create that imagery,
Mm.
and those sensations and and memories. And so, in a way, it's true. In a non-trivial way, it's true. But to set that up in a discussion with somebody for a TV show, it's quite difficult because you have to get the whole baseline down, and the way the brain works. It's funny because it's got to set up all these baseline default networks, right?
Mm.
And once you set that up, then you bounce off of that by turning parts on and parts off. And so it's not the way you would think of engineering a mind. It's not so obvious. It's how you engineer, transgenerational emotion.
Mm.
It's a more distant sort of. It is a bridge too far for people, but I still do a lot of talks on this, and it's fun. So maybe my agent wants me to do something on that, but so there is more interesting science to talk about, and
Yeah, I
another
wanna
one of the
I wanna get into that science, and I'm also curious about the spiritual perception things you've been talking about. You mentioned it at the end of the book, and the clairvoyance and the dualities. I want to get into that. And first, I kind of wanted to lay the general base of psychopathy. And there's a quote in the book where you say, "I see psychopathy like others see art. I can't define it, but I know when I see it." So to you, I wanted to ask, as someone who's studied violent psychopaths for over a decade, you've analyzed their brains. In the book, and we can say it up front because you learned very early on in the book, I believe it's also on the book jacket, that you discovered that you yourself fit into the category of psychopath. You described yourself as a pro-social psychopath in the book. So I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the brush strokes of being a psychopath? Because you may not be able to define it, very specifically. Like, you can't define the Mona Lisa, but like, what do you see as the brush strokes of what makes a psychopath a psychopath?
just the whole predatory nature of it. I mean, there are other personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, and that are predatory also. So one of the problems is that psychopathy overlaps with these other personality disorders, and not only that, but with different psychopathologies. Now, psychopathologies are like major depression and schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, and those there's a large, a hefty percentage of murderers are in those psychiatric groups too. But there is a dissociative sense about, you talk to people who have this. I'm not a psychopath. I have traits of psychopathy, of this pro-social, if you have pro-social psychopathic traits, it allows you to navigate through society and seem absolutely normal. Okay, and so I may not seem that right now, but generally people who would meet me or other people with these traits would say I was a nice regular guy, and I consider myself just a regular guy for sure. And and I think, but if you meet a full-blown psychopath, the hair stands on end because
Mm.
the coldness, the callousness and coldness is palpable. And I've interviewed people who are just really pretty severe, who are real predators and pedophiles, rapists, murderers. And you talk to them, they dissociate themselves so much from the acts that they
Mm.
perform. They,
So
they distance themselves.
you've sat in the
It's it,
room. You've sat in the room talking face to face with some of these people who've
yeah,
been
yeah.
serial killers. You said pedophiles. What does it feel like in that moment? If even if you take out the task of interviewing them, you said it makes your hair stand on end. Are there any other words or feelings that you can put to that where you're in the presence of someone and
Well, like they're a piece of meat.
something just changes in the air? Like what does it feel like to be in there with them?
Well, they treat you, consider you, look at you like a piece of meat, purely as a piece of meat to eat or destroy or just consume, to own. So the thing with psychopathy is owning somebody. You're owning them in the moment. You get them to believe in your whole world. They get wrapped up in your world, and they can do that. So they're very good at that. Um, I, one guy that I really liked was really psychopathic, and we got along great. He was a guy who created a lot of the torture techniques that were used in gulags and
Mm.
the prison camps in Ukraine and the Soviet Union. And we spent a fair amount of time together in Ukraine because I did a series of movies with him. The movies are called DAU, DAU, and that was the whole project was DAO, and people can download those. Those are very strange films, and they I mean, lawsuits are on those because they're so disconcerting. But I think the Dow films give a good characterization of psychopathy. It's about psychopathy.
Mm.
It's about the psychopathy of the Soviet Union. It's about the psychopathy of people who create torture techniques and who. I mean, they had one guy on set there that we lived with who was a real Nazi. I mean, he would, and he came in on set and killed a pig with a knife. It just bled him out, and would just attack with the women. It was pretty bad, but that's a good sort of
Mm.
characterization
The
of that. And he could be a sociopath too.
yeah.
This guy
The
was a psychopath, but it could be a
the
sociopath.
the film you mentioned, Dow, was that a film specifically about this guy who created torture devices in the Ukraine? Was it just incorporating these torture devices? What was the plot of the film?
Dow was Lev Landau, who was the guy who created the Soviet atom bomb. And so Stalin kept him very close. Stalin built a institute in which he put all these scientists and artists and different people. And so the filmmaker created this whole set, this enormous set, which was a recreation of the institute in Moscow. And he invited a bunch of us, and we played ourselves. We just played ourselves. This was the Truman Show on more than adrenochrome. This was, or steroids. I mean, and it was And he brought on all these different, very interesting people, artists, scientists, shamans were there. And the whole thing was just about as trippy as you can get. And they had, and this guy who created all these torture techniques, but he and I hit it off great.
Mm.
We gave talks together about psychopathy. And as part of it, I got to meet the guys who broke up the Soviet Union, spent a lot of time with the head of the jihadist movement in Britain. He and I gave a talk together on terrorism, kind of the history of it, how you create a narrative for anarchists, how you create a narrative for people who want to destroy the world and destroy people in the world. So working with these, terrorists and torture experts, that wasn't so strange because they were kind of regular guys, amazingly.
Mm.
You probably hit it off with them because they're straight away with it. And
so to go back to the guy who made the torture devices, I suppose that there is a type of person who could manufacture torture devices and just create a machine that could torture people that isn't a psychopath. Maybe it's just someone who's making a device that, he doesn't understand or she doesn't understand how it's being used, but they're good at it. And then over time, it starts to get used for torture. What makes this guy who is making the torture devices a psychopath beyond just creating the torture devices? Did he enjoy the aspect of torture? Did he like the control?
He wasn't a sadist. In fact, psychopaths are not particularly sadists, but the whole thing was mind manipulation. It was, I own you.
Mm.
The whole idea is, I'm talking to you right now and I own you. That's the whole game. And he liked that game. He was professionally a psychologist. And so he knew, he was a trained psychologist, knew a lot about psychiatry, and he got off on owning people and just blowing their minds. He did too. But
I mean, that's like the ultimate form of ownership, is torturing someone, because in a way, if you're a serial killer, the second that you kill someone, it's almost like you're releasing them and you no longer have control over their body, their mind, they're just gone. But if you're keeping someone in a perpetual state of torture, you can control their psychology, you can control their voice, their body, like in the deepest and darkest ways. They completely are they're completely submitted to you. So just hearing you talk about the ownership aspect of psychopathy, it makes total sense that a guy like that who is a full-blown psychopath would be drawn to the torturing aspect or just like the elements of torture.
Yeah, he ended up dying the day I left Ukraine. The day after, we think he might have been murdered. He was no friend of Putin, that's for sure. None of us were.
So you think he could have been murdered by Putin or someone who Putin ordered to murder him?
The people I work with there, and I ended up spending a lot of time with, and I did an interview with the diaspora, the journalist, the TV diaspora of Russia in Georgia. So I did a TV show there on Putin because I'd done an interview with a Ukrainian journalist turned, military. The last couple of interviews I did with him, he was in a bunker And they were like, one of those things like the place is shaking and the dust is coming down. I'm going, what the hell's going on? He said, these are incoming missiles. It's Russian missiles. So they were done in like a bunker, that guy. And then I ended up spending time, talking to the U.S. aid, which is kind of the CIA money. And I know a lot of people in Russia and Ukraine and in Chechnya. I know the ex-prime minister from Chechnya, really cool guy. And
How long ago was
and
this?
so this is over the period of 2000 to a couple of years ago when I was last in Ukraine.
Hmm.
I'm still in contact with all of them, and with John Sweeney, who's over there, a BBC guy.
So
So,
these guys would be on the side of the Ukrainians and the current conflict.
oh yeah, yeah. Most of the people I know are like that. Not everybody, but for various crazy reasons. But yeah, the people I know are very much anti-Putin. And I did a long interview on the full history as I know it because
Hmm.
I, you know, of Putin, his upbringing, well, I think he's a true psychopath. I don't think all these guys are psychopaths, but he's got all the traits,
Hmm.
and has a background of the key thing is were you brought up either without parents or in an abusive, broken family? I mean, that's a key thing for one of the key things for these these sort of predatorial personality, what I call cluster B personality disorders, is that almost everyone. I studied a bunch of dictators, and I know people who were close to them, and meet with the dissidents in Cuba and Venezuela and Syria and Russia and Ukraine, etc. And so I know something about their background, how they're brought up,
Hmm.
and taking that. A key part of all of it, all these, not only psychopaths, the cluster Bs, and these very pernicious, murderous dictators, they all had a terrible childhood. Every one of them. I
Hmm.
mean, there's no. It's this is a societal disease that can be prevented. Right? It's one of the few things that can be completely prevented, because it's almost all of them. It's really triggered epigenetically in early childhood, from birth to 3 years old,
So
and
just having psychopathic genes is not enough for you to be violent or abusive in power later on in your life. There usually has to be some triggering event or series of events earlier on in your
it
childhood.
seems that way. It's a young science, but it seems that
Mm.
way. And you can show this even in animals. You can show it in rhesus monkeys and rats. You can show, and the idea is that those genes that are under the control somewhat of stress hormones, cortisol,
Mm.
and which are forever changed. They're the promoters and the things that control the expression of those genes are changed for your lifetime, and therefore it takes that out of context. So you can kill somebody. Killing somebody can be homicide. That doesn't make it murder. If somebody's
Mm.
trying to kill you, you can kill them
Yeah.
in most places in the world. So that's the context matters, and the epigenetic changes. It's like taking a brick and putting it on a gas pedal in your car, so it's always on. So there's never any context that comes in to mollify it or modify it or inhibit it.
Mm.
And so yeah, in almost every case I've ever looked at, certainly all the murderers, certainly the serial killers, but all these really, you know 2,000 years, 3,000
Yeah.
years of
So
of murderous dictators.
so the genes you said that like the brick, they're applying constant pressure to who you are, your actions. How much can the way that you're brought up influence the weight of that brick? Like, can the way your parents raise you, your early interactions, can that chip away at the brick so it's not so strong? Or can that change? Can that alleviate the pressure a little bit? Or once the brick is laid on the gas pedal, there's no way to throw on the brake?
Depends on the specific genetic alleles that you inherit. Some of the ones that control the metabolism of serotonin in the frontal lobe and in the amygdala and the parts of the brain that are most social, if you will, or antisocial. And so, but one of them is the serotonin transporter, SERT, SERT, and if you have if you've inherited from your parents the forms, the alleles that make you very susceptible, okay, to early violence or being abandoned, it's all bad news. The one thing, though, and this was shown in humans and even in non-human primates, that if you're treated well, that same gene, the regulation of the same serotonin gene, actually protects you against the negative effects of the other genes, the other so-called warrior genes or low emotional empathy genes. And so it can work both ways. Those are all, they're bricks on the brake and they're bricks on the gas pedal. And so the balance of those, if you're brought up without any sort of abuse, you're basically what your genes are, the traits, personality traits. Whether there's one way of defining them, the simplest way is called the Big Five, OCEAN. The amount of openness. O is the openness. Conscientiousness, how conscientious you are. Extroversion. And also how psychotic you are. And these are things called the stranger traits. That is, when a stranger meets you, they says he's very open. He's willing to share ideas. He's open to new ideas, and she's very. They make people very attractive and fun. Those are called the Big Five traits, and those are pretty much genetically determined. There's about 15 to 50 genes for each of these traits, and it depends on the overall balance of what you have. But some of the alleles are very susceptible to cortisol. So if you stress a kid, either by abusing them or abandoning them, well, that abuse will affect the stress genes, which will affect the genes that are going to be creating and metabolizing dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine in your brain. And it will end up changing the connections of those, what are called connectomes. So the connections of the brain that will subserve a particular function, whether it's emotional empathy or cognitive empathy or violence, aggressiveness, dominance, etc. So you're basically your genes unless you're abused. Then all bets are off.
So is there a range early in life where the abuse can have a stronger effect than if you were abused later on or earlier on? Like, is there like as a parent from birth to 10 years old, let's say, is there a range within that range where it's like you absolutely don't want to fuck this range up or else you're just permanently fucked?
Yeah, it's birth to 4 years old.
Birth to 4
is the most susceptible. There is, if you're abused later, what's called the growth period. The growth period is like from 5 to 10 years old. And the growth period probably has to do with whether you become a sociopath or not. It's different than a psychopath. So that's later. They later, like when somebody who's bullied, the sociopath who's bullied, and then tries to get even with the world. Those people, those sociopaths who do this stuff, they know what they're doing is wrong, but they do it anyway. If you confront them with it, they show remorse and guilt, whereas a psychopath shows no remorse or guilt. So they're very different creatures.
So the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath is the guilt that they feel after the fact?
Well, a psychopath believes his own shit. You know, it's if you take somebody who there's maybe it's easier if you look at somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder. There's OCD. There are people who have obsessive compulsive disorder who do obsessive and compulsive things. And then there are people who have obsessive compulsive personality disorder. The personality disorder form of it's different because they really believe their thoughts are okay. Whereas somebody with just OCD, they know they're crazy, but they can't control them. But the personality disorder parts of these, they really believe it. And so and so if you really believe something and somebody then, a cop comes up and says, "What are you doing?" or your wife catches you doing something, you don't act guilty because you really don't care. There's no moral reasoning, so there is no conflict. So there are no tells. There's no emotional tells of guilt.
Yeah. So a sociopath has a self-awareness of their own pathology. They recognize that they're doing something wrong. But a psychopath is just completely immersed in their wrongdoing to the point where they don't recognize it as wrong or anything's off.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying. That's a good way of saying it. It's a very good way of putting it.
Yeah. I've had times in my life where you get caught like you get caught in a lie. I've had times where I'm caught deep in a lie and I repeat the lie over and over again to the point where it starts to become reality. And then 10 years later, you might tell a story that incorporates the lie as if it happened. And then in a way, it feels like truth, even though rationally I know that I made that up. And if I went back far enough, if I analyzed it, I can go, oh no, that started as a lie. But there's almost like this blockage that goes on with lying to where if you need someone to believe it, or if you're just like caught so badly to the point of embarrassment where something in your mind switches and you just don't want to give up. I've been there with certain lies where I start to convince myself that it's true, and the self-awareness disappears. Like I'm not even self-aware of it anymore.
Yeah, that's the stuff. You got a good grasp of this. That's it, to the point where you say, no, this is me. This is the truth. And even if it isn't, I don't care. I'm sticking with this story. You become a professional liar. And of course, psychopaths are professional liars because they don't care. They're able to, they just, can choose it that way. There's no problem with it.
So a psychopath lives in that state. They don't dip in occasionally and dip out. They're just like constantly believing their own form of reality.
Yeah, well, that's the idea. You had mentioned duality.
Yeah.
It's been shown that psychopaths have a very poor appreciation of dualities. And dualities is like good and evil, left and right side, up and down, the outside of my body, the inside of my body, what I own, what I don't own. These all become very blurred for a psychopath. They just don't have that sense. So, and so the truth and a lie is a duality. That's a duality. And I think you explained it pretty well there. You get so caught up in it, you can't get away. You don't really want to get away, and you just stick with that story, really knowing that it's a lie.
So a psychopath would hate reading the Bible because the entire Bible is basically just good versus evil. Good deeds, bad deeds. That to a psychopath, it would all just be one mumbled thing. There would be no distinction between this book of the Bible, this bad thing happened, and then there's redemption and evil. It's just all, it's just kind of a vast land of actions without any moral tag specified to it.
Well, I gave a talk in Mumbai in India, Mumbai Literary Festival. It was a huge literary festival. And I had to give a couple of talks on this, on not only evil people I knew, but about that sense you're talking about, the duality. And I said in one talk, I said, I live in a flat, emotionally flat world. That is, I care about people, but being close to me doesn't help. You could be a stranger and get more emotional empathy from me than being close to me. And that's a problem of it. And in fact, those parts of the brain that contrast these things of morality versus drive for violence or something, those connections in the brain between the amygdala and the orbital cortex, that pathway is not developed well at all in psychopaths. It's very small. So you actually see the brain pathways as being smaller, and the areas don't interact like in a normal person. But those interactions between that area that regular psychoanalytic theory, like a Freudian thing, like ego versus id versus superego or conscience, those sort of contrasts for psychopath are very difficult.
Do you think there's a disproportionate amount of politicians who are psychopaths? Because it seems like to be a politician, you have to have very flexible morals, to put it in a positive sense. And you're constantly making deals, backdoor arrangements. You also have ownership essentially with your power. It's a position that can put people in vast positions of power. Do you think there are a disproportionate amount of psychopaths that gravitate towards political positions?
I think the highest percentage of psychopaths can be found in journalism.
Oh, wow. Okay. Why do you think that is?
Because they're all about manipulation. They're all about and most of the ones I've talked to are honest about it. I think would recognize honesty with what they're saying. They like, manipulating people, and the truth is whatever works, right? It's whatever works, that's no morality at all, really. They may understand ethics, that is, they know the rules of the game, but the fundamental underlying morality can be really easily lost in them. But for politicians, to define the negative aspects, the so-called evil aspects of psychopathy, everything's normed. That is, it's compared to whatever subculture you live in. So if you live in a subculture, and I was having this discussion with several psychiatrists I know, who are, one's a Buddhist, it goes the whole spectrum. It's all the Abrahamic religions plus Buddha. And it's like for all of psychiatry and for the ethics and morality of it, it's like, what is your subculture? If your subculture says that something's okay, then what you're doing is not psychopathic. I mean, if you want to look at sociopathic behaviors, you look at most major cities in the United States right now, you see it all over the place. This is all what psychopathy. But if people say, well, this is what all the people I know do this. This is my subculture.
So
then
if you're committing morally depraved actions that are also socially acceptable, that doesn't make you a psychopath. Like for instance, there's some countries in the Middle East where you get thrown off a roof or burned alive for being an outed gay man or homosexual.
Right.
If you were just lighting gay people on fire in Brooklyn, New York, that would be considered psychopathic, I imagine. But if you were to do that in Saudi Arabia, where people get their hands cut off for stealing fruit, that may not, it's a terrible thing to do, but it may not make you a psychopath.
Or evil, or crazy, or anything. In front of the law, or, you know, in terms of the psychiatry of it, and the morality of it. You have to know that what you're doing is seriously wrong, and knowing that, you have to then go ahead and do it anyway. And that, to make it evil or wrong, and it's true with the, you know, personality disorders. And so if you, and this is, you know, it makes people nervous because, and it should, because if everything's defined by cultural moral relativity, you can always get away with anything, which people do.
I believe there's certainly cultural norms and ethical norms, but also an objective morality that, regardless of cultural norms, is either felt by the population or can be rationally thought through to people who may not feel it. And it sounds weird to say objective morality and then also say like people can feel it, right or wrong. But I don't know. I've been thinking about this question a lot with free will, like what makes someone good versus evil, and if your actions and the person you are almost entirely determined by your genetics and your environment, is there a way that someone could have acted otherwise? And Sam Harris talks a lot about this with free will, that every action in your life, there's an entire lifetime that led up to it, with the environment, the people you have spoken to, the people you've done things to, who've done things to you, and also your genetics mixed in with that. And that if you look at every individual action, there's no other way you could have acted up to that point. You can apply pressure to people and they may act differently in the future, but there's no real choice in that moment. And it's not necessarily predeterminism, because you can apply pressures and alter the way that people act. But I've been thinking a lot recently about, you know, if someone was raised in an environment where terrible things are acceptable and they're brought up to think that's okay, and they have this skewed sense of ethics in the face of an objective morality, and they're not in touch with that morality, what's right and wrong on a human level, does that make a person evil for committing the acts that society views as evil? That Western society, you know, someone in Brooklyn, New York might see something in the Middle East and say that is the definition of evil, and it's hard to say no to that. But there's another place to look at it where you have to take into account the person's genetics and the person's environment, and ask yourself, like, is there another way that person really could have acted in that moment? Is it possible? Is there something? Does free will exist? The notion of free will, where you have these infinite number of choices in the moment and you can go in any direction? Or are we on this track to where you have a very limited number of options because everyone is influenced by their environment and genetics?
Well, if you take any kid, if you ask a really young kid, not just a toddler, but older than that, they have a very keen sense of morality, what's right and wrong. So do animals. I mean, look at monkeys know right from wrong. That is, you're not allowed to kill somebody or steal from them. They have, you know, animals have this basics. Many animals have this, and kids have it. And so it's something that Plato would understand, right? That there are these ideals that we probably inherit. He didn't know, and those philosophers who had this sort of idea that there are these, that there are these ideals. Well, they didn't know about genetics, but they thought a lot and they talked a lot. And so I think if you say animals know that you're not supposed to take something from somebody else, animals know that you're not supposed to kill another person in the species unless they're trying to kill you or kill somebody in your family. I mean, these are very basic things, and they're pretty well deep into the psyche of our Abrahamic religions, right? I mean, there's not much conflict there.
Mm.
Now, that's one part of it, is that there seems to be a very fundamental thing that's probably genetically determined. That is where the ideals are that we all know. We all know, and if we violate those, it's immorality.
So do you think that social cultural norms can override that innate sense of morality if they're strong enough? Like if you're in a place where violence is normal, where it's okay to kill certain types of people, even though you may be born with an innate sense of it's wrong to kill a person, if you're constantly seeing violent actions and murder around you, do you think it gets to a point where that external ethics overrides your internal morals?
That's the world of psychopathy, right? Where all those things are perfectly fine. Yeah.
Mm.
They become morality itself. And so, yes, there are those conditions, but they seem to have to be violated and instilled very early in your life when your prefrontal cortex is still developing.
So that birth to 4-year period, that's when, if you're exposed to some of these things, violent actions, abuse, that's when those ethical wrongdoings can override that innate sense of morality that we all have. That's when it's the strongest chance of messing you up.
But because a kid will if not abused and not abandoned, will develop this sense of morality. There's about 350 what are called complex adaptive behaviors. This is a bit more than just personality traits. The complex, these are different kinds of fears that you have. Complex adaptive behaviors would include your sense of beauty and what we're talking about here, and morality. And so they seem to develop in the absence of a family. They will develop because the genes will drive the brain to hook up in such a way that these things will be realized, will be recognized immediately, almost intuitively.
Mm.
And so, yeah, that's seems to be the natural order of things. And if many animals have the same thing, and kids all have it, unless they're abused, then you would say that this is an inherent thing. And now the ability to overcome this, that is the free will, is, you talk to any neuroscientist, every neuroscientist has a different idea about this, whether it exists or not. And there are experiments that are hard to interpret because you see those signals that would normally signal intention, these signals that involve the frontal lobe and parietal cortex. And the thing is, the timing of them isn't so obviously tied to a volitional act. In some cases, it follows the volitional act. It doesn't lead it. And so there's a lot of...
So the sense of free will is retroactive in some cases, where you do an action, like I pick up this book. I don't know why I just chose to pick it up right now, but I can retroactively convince myself that I wanted to pick up this book, so I did. But in reality, it was more of a reaction than willed action.
Yeah, this is the sense of retrocausality, right?
Mm.
Also, you said, well, whatever I just did is, yeah, that's what I meant. Well, you're just making it up. You see people making it up all the time. I mean, Zach. You see, you've thought about this stuff and you're honest about it, and you see all the holes in it.
Yeah. I
Many
see the
people,
I see the holes in the classical sense of free will where everyone has an infinite amount of choices in the moment and you can pick any direction you want. I used to think I went to a Catholic high school. I was instilled with that sort of Catholic guilt of right and wrong. And for everything that I did wrong, it was multiplied because I thought that I had these infinite possibilities of all I had to do was just pick anything but the thing that I did. And I started learning more about free will, more about genetics, more about, reading books like this one where I'm learning about the connection between genetics and action and environmental upbringing and action. And the more that I learn about it, the more that I see people committing actions that society deems as evil. And I believe that those people should be separated by society because they're a threat to society. But I don't know where the punishment fits in because did that person ever have a chance to be anything else? Or was their, their dice, like the dice rolled, they had genes, they were abused at 2, 3 years old early on in life. And, from there, their cards were dealt and like that was that. So the more I've thought about free will, the more I am willing to see the other side of the argument or just like the other side of human nature, which is that there's a lot that goes on that isn't just a choice between I could have done I did X in the moment, but I could have also done A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I think in that moment, it was pretty much only X. And then depending on your situation, you can be influenced to choose differently in the future. But in that very specific moment, X was what you were going to do. That's the way that I feel now. I'm open to changing that opinion as I, speak to people like you and read more about it. But that's the way I feel about free will right now, that it's,
yeah, I think free will is highly overrated, like you do.
yeah.
I think it is, and that's not only looking at it from a neuroscience point of view, but just behaviorally and self-reflectively. Look at my own behavior and certainly the people around me. I'm 75, and so over 75 years, I would say looking at the behavior of people, they do not seem to act like they really have free will in the Abrahamic or Catholic sense, or any of that. And I think it's highly overrated,
Mm.
and experimentally, there's not much support for it. Now, it'd be nice if it was true, right? Well, maybe it wouldn't be nice if you really had free will. I mean, how many people would just like to kill a bunch of people right now? That would
Yeah,
be their free
if
will.
that was an option, that's the other side of it. People, you can't you think of the infinite options if we did have the ultimate sense of free will, but then with those options, if you could truly, you know, spin like the fucking dial and it just turns and it can land anywhere you want and you can influence that dial, how much harder would it be to live as a good person? Like if you get decent genetics and you have a good upbringing, that that makes it a lot easier to be a good person. But if you have decent genetics and have a good upbringing, and also you can make an infinite amount of evil decisions because of free will, then that is a much scarier world to live in,
I,
to me.
I, I love my wife, who I've known, who I've been dating for what? We were both 12 years old, so we're 75
Wow.
now. So 63 years, and I mean, her
So
her spin on this, her
so you,
spin on
you always win the competition in weddings where they say stay dancing if you've been married the longest.
like that.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, it's yeah, we've known each other a very long time. But her angle on it, she says, if you want to know a real psychopath, just follow a 13-year-old girl around, getting doing all sorts of evil things to her so-called best friend. She said, and so, and she has even, I think, a darker view than I do of it. Most of the people I know who I've seen do really bad things, a lot of bad things. They always try to offset it by doing something good,
Mm.
right? There's always that. They think they can offset their evil by doing some good, that there's some sort of balance you can make, which I don't buy. But
I mean, that's the Catholic way. That's you have premarital sex, you watch porn, you punch your friend in the face, and then you offset it by saying 10 Hail Marys, 10 Our Fathers, and then the slate is clean. And then you're good to go until you fuck up again. Then it's just a constant cycle of confession until you're forgiven.
yeah, so and an interesting thing about that is that it's most religions have a way to be forgiven, right? If you're a
Hmm.
Catholic, you can be, or Jewish, or there are ways of making peace with yourself and with your God. There's always ways of doing that in each of these religions. But there isn't. If you're a psychopath, there's nothing you can do about it.
Mm.
You're screwed, right? So it's better, in a sense, it's better to accept the sin part of things, because sins you can always be forgiven for sins. You can't for psychopathy. You can't fix it. You can't be forgiven for this stuff. And so for me, I was so OCD. I thought that everything had to be perfect in your life. You had to be
Mm.
perfect, and that's I think it's a fair number of people who have that particular hang up,
Yeah.
which is it's the idea of perfection. That's real OCD, and you live. You have to live in this perfect world, and that's because it's fair. You're fair to everything, and there's always
Hmm.
this balance. There's that. So those. It's another way of looking at dualities, that you
Mm.
can balance the good and
Mm.
evil off.
So,
And I don't really believe that, and you don't either.
yeah.
But yeah, but it's this whole way of ultimate balance.
Can
I mean,
it's can
certainly, if there's a God, this God must weigh things, the
mm.
positive and negative. I don't believe that for a
I
second.
mean the Old Testament God might have been a psychopath. There's based on
Well, you
the
want a
things that he's done.
psychopath, yeah. That's why
The Old Testament is like punishing, setting fire, hell and brimstone, and then the New Testament is like manipulation through goodwill and savior. And so there's like, I don't know, there's definitely if you're an alien and you come down and you read the Bible and you have no notion of God or Christianity, anything like that, you'd be like, God's a fucking psychopath. Like whoever is doing
oh
all
sure,
the protagonist in this novel is a psychopath. If you look at the Bible just as any other story, it seems psychopathic.
I agree. I completely agree, and it seems completely manipulative too,
Yeah.
and unnecessary. If you really define the God as the way the God is defined, it's spurious, playful, cruel, and not irrational, but sort of evil. And yeah, I agree with you. The but if you look at other religions, if you look at the non-Abrahamics, and I guess Buddhism isn't really a religion, right?
Yeah, more
The
of a way of
Western religion,
life.
way of life type of thing.
So can you tell the story of how you discovered that you fit the mold of a psychopath, because you mentioned you share traits of a psychopath. You're not a full blown psychopath, but you're a pro social psychopath. Can you tell the story of how you discovered that?
Yeah, I had since 1989 had been studying the brain scans, PET scans, and then after that, fMRIs and SPECT scans of murderers, including serial killers, and so I did that for a couple of decades, and then finally in about 2005, I saw a pattern emerge. That it was what is the pattern of brain activity that separates a normal person from somebody with schizophrenia and somebody with is an impulsive murderer or a psychopathic murderer. And these patterns jumped out. It was quite remarkable to me because I'd never read that there was a pattern to this. And uh, so I looked at many, like 80 and 100 scans, and I told them to blind it, cover the names up. I don't want to know anybody's names, and so this I had all these colleagues sent me who were doing scans of murderers, and so I had a pile of them on my desk. You've seen these color images of red parts of the brain are higher activity than normal, blue and black and green are lower activity. So you get this idea of how the person stacks up against a normal person under different conditions. And so while doing that, our lab was also looking for genes that were responsible for schizophrenia, like I mentioned, but also for Alzheimer's disease. And so we were looking at a lot of Alzheimer's. And the thing is, at that time, 2005, we had all the patients, the Alzheimer's patients we needed. We didn't have enough controls. So I volunteered my family and me as controls in the experiment. I said, none of us have Alzheimer's, none of us have psychopathy, certainly. And so I volunteered us all. That was probably my first mistake. But so we all went in, and including my brothers, my wife, our kids, myself. My mother was involved in part of it. My aunt, my Brooklyn aunt, and my part of it.
Mm.
She was a lot of fun. And so anyway, when those results came back from the Alzheimer's study, it was completely separate. There wasn't any murders or anything. The technicians brought them into my office. I laid them down, and I looked at them, and I started to go through all of these. And I've seen so many PET scans, so many fMRIs. I kind of know what normal looks like, and so as I was going through, I just started cracking up, and I said, I got to the bottom of this large pile of all these scans, and I said, guys, you slipped in one of the murderers. You slipped in one of the psychopaths. Pretty funny. They go, no,
Yeah.
no, we didn't. And I said, okay, then what is this about? And they said, this is somebody in your family. I said, this person should not be walking around in open public. This is very psychopathic. It looked just like the worst case of psychopathy. They said, no, it's somebody in your family. So at that point, I thought it was my civic duty to tear the tape off the name that was covering all these. And almost everybody was normal. And I got to this bottom one, which was very abnormal, looked like just like a psychopath. And it was me, of course. I mean, that was the day that Gandalf showed up at my door and knocked and said, "You're it." And I kind of
Yeah.
got the joke, it was. But that's when that started a whole series of things. Then I went through my genetics, and it was the same thing. I have the genetics that codes for all these traits that are consistent with psychopathy, and so I had the biological markers. And it wasn't until I gave a talk in Norway, and I gave a talk with the former prime minister of Norway. He had bipolar. And I was trying to show everybody in the audience how we use statistical mathematical techniques to see which genes are associated with which behaviors, which disorders. So at the end of mine, the head of the Department of Psychiatry stood up. He goes, "Thanks, I appreciate it. That was good." He said, "First of all, you have bipolar and you don't know it because they saw all my biological data and all my traits." And they said, "No, you have a case of bipolar, so that's nice." And then they
So
said,
you
"We also want to talk to you afterwards."
so you discovered, how far apart was it from when you saw your own brain scan that matched what a psychopath would look like, and then you discovered, or this guy came up to you and said you have bipolar disorder? How much time passed
It was
between?
about 7 years.
Okay. So you had
And he,
time to digest the psychopath revelation before the
the
bipolar disorder. It
pattern,
wasn't
yeah.
like back to
But
back.
and I didn't care. I didn't care. I really didn't. It didn't bother me. I said, I know myself. My theory must be wrong. Problem is the theory looks like it wasn't wrong, and that is the pattern of the brain. And they said, we want to talk to you afterwards. So I met them afterwards at the president, rector of the University of Oslo in Norway, with all these psychiatrists there. They said, you're probably a psychopath. You don't even know it. I said, come on. And then when I went home, I started asking everybody, starting with my wife and my kids, my brothers, my mother. By that time, my mother was 102. And so they said, well, yeah, we've told you for years that you do these psychopathic things. You just laugh them off. And so when I started talking to people, then I got diagnosed by a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist who said that I have all the thoughts and drives of a psychopath. I just don't act them out, which means if you don't act them out, you're not really a psychopath. So that was kind of nice to know. Yeah. But they said you basically have all these drives and dreams and thoughts of one. And so that's how that happened.
What did it feel like in the moment to get not the psychopathic diagnosis, because like you said, you don't act it out, but what did it feel like to be put in an adjacent category to psychopaths, like full-blown psychopaths?
I just thought it was funny. I knew
Yeah.
the joke that I was studying all these psychopathic killers and that I had the pattern. It's kind of funny. I knew it was funny.
Yeah.
So there was that part, but I didn't care. I didn't. And the one psychiatrist I know, he asked the same exact question you did. I said, I don't give a shit. He goes, that's the problem. You don't care. You really don't care. And that was exactly the same question.
But I would say finding something funny is a version of caring, because it generates a reaction within you. Not truly not caring at all would be just like there's not an emotion that runs through you. But if you find something out and that makes you laugh, it could be a defense mechanism. It could truly be funny. But there is an emotion there. I wouldn't say that's not feeling anything.
Well, I thought it was, I thought it was just funny. It was,
Yeah.
Here's a guy, a scientist who's studying all these people, really, very nasty people, and he's got the same thing. That by itself there's a certain amount of irony and humor there, right? And I got that, but I didn't really care what it meant. I didn't, because I said I'm okay. I'm fine, and so.
Do you feel like there's some sort of, I don't know what it is, a spiritual connection, or a some sort of ethereal drive that brought you closer to psychopaths, to wanting to study psychopaths? It's like if I spent my entire life studying pickles and I made pickles, and then when I was 50 years old, I got tested and it's like, oh my God, I'm a pickle. Like there must be some sort of connection there to wanting to understand the thing that you are.
Um, Well, in our family, we've got a family full of murderers. And so there might be something there because we got a lot of people, a lot of grandfathers, great grandfathers who are murderers and bad actors, not just murderers, but did nasty things. And and it kind of ran in the lore of our family. And there's there's a famous murder, an unsolved murder in the United States that implicates my grandparents.
Is that
And
you mentioned Thomas Cornell and Lizzie? Is it Lizzie Borden in the book?
Thomas Cornell he's the first white American to kill his mother.
And that is your that is your cousin or
No,
grandfather?
he's a direct grandfather.
Direct grandfather.
We have, we've done extensive genealogy in our family by people who really know how to do it. And we've got 5 lines of people who are nasty. But they're also in that group, there's a lot of people who are very well behaved,
Mm-hmm.
Priests and nuns and very, very moral people. So it's kind of a combination of the two.
And Thomas Cornell was the first person to kill his mother, you said? First American person?
First white American in the white colonies. Yeah, the first case of matricide.
To kill his
was
mother.
Thomas Cornell. And then we have a lot of cousins too. Even though people in the family, the Cornells and the Borden family, our family, they said, well, Lizzie Borden she was found not guilty. Well, I don't know if you read this.
What was the crime of Lizzie Borden again? Because I'm not actually familiar with the crime specifically.
Killing her mother and father with an axe.
Holy shit. And
Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. And when she said what she had done, she gave her father 41. And but we've got other people who are just as, bad news. I mean, the whole story of, if you look at the story of Twin Peaks, Laura Palmer, the murder of Laura Palmer is really from upstate New York. It's the murder of somebody else, of a real person back in 1908.
mm-hmm.
And that it's where we grew up. And we have family that's implicated in that, even though part of our family, of course, it makes them crazy to think about this. Other people think it's just entertaining, I guess. But this has everything. Yeah, Twin Peaks, and it's a case of the murder of Hazel Drew, upstate New York, around Troy, New York, where we all grew up. I went fishing up there all the time, right near where she was murdered. And I used to park on her grave. I mean, I remember, on her cemetery plot. But that was something that there was a documentary made by this filmmaker, John Hoser, up in Troy, New York, about that. And it's about,
And is that the one that's unsolved? The one that Twin Peaks is based on?
Yeah, that's probably the most famous unsolved American murder.
And that's linked. That's linked to your family history as well, or there's no link.
Yes.
So what's the link if it's unsolved?
Our grandparents.
So your grandparents may have done it, or
yes,
they're suspected to have done it.
I mean, most of our people in our family say, "No way, he didn't do it." I mean, we all loved him.
Yeah.
And, my grandfather. But there now are better. There are better suspects now. Another book came out, supposedly better suspects, even though this whole documentary concludes that the two main suspects are my grandfather and great grandfather. And
so Thomas Cornell and then his father, Thomas Cornell's father.
No, this is just, I'm talking about recent history.
Oh, recent. Okay.
Thomas Cornell is great, 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 great.
Great. Okay.
I'm just talking about grandfather and great grandfather. Yeah.
So your grandfather and great grandfather it's possible that they committed this murder together.
Yeah. And so it's just that there's a lot of this stuff in our family, right? And
Yeah. A lot of things in the
the kids like
genetics
it.
and the gene pool. So even if you take out the unknown, the unsolved murder, you still have Lizzie Borden, who is the axe murderer, killed both of her parents, 40 slashes to the mom, 41 to the dad, which, does 41 mean you like your dad more or less, like one for good luck?
You have more feelings.
Who knows if she was counting, like, oh, I did 40, one more for good measure. And then you have Thomas Cornell, who was the first case of matricide, who's a white colonialist. So even if you take out the unsolved white colonist, even if you take out the unsolved murder, you have a heavy genetic influence of violent murderers in your gene pool.
Yes. On the Sicilian side, there's none. They're all almost angelic. They're just bootleggers but on the English side, it's a whole other story.
Mm.
You can imagine my cousins hate when I talk about this. I don't, some people it makes them crazy, and some people they don't care at all. The reactions are very interesting. How split they are.
Yeah, well, I would think that would be the reaction. You said the reaction is interesting. I would say the story itself is interesting because if it's in your family, the more information you have on what happened, the more information you have on your history, your genetics. You're also a neuroscientist. You're professionally interested in this as well. And if I had an axe murderer in my family, if I had an unsolved murder that could possibly be in my family, if I had the same family tree that you had, even if I wasn't a neuroscientist, if my mom said, "Hey, you want to know about your great grandfather who murdered his parents?" I would say, "Fuck yeah!" Like that.
Sure.
That at a base level is fascinating, and finding out the details of that and talking about it, it's a terrible thing, and it's something that's dark, and I understand how people may want to block that out, but also it is a part of the lineage. It is something that happened and could possibly be passed down in the gene pool. So I would think that the more information you have on it, the better. And just the story itself is something to be told.
Yeah, I agree with. I think you and I agree on a lot of things, as it turns out.
Yeah,
we didn't plan this, but maybe that's why you contacted me, right?
Yeah, I mean, I contacted you once I got the book. I started going through it and realized pretty early on that it seemed like we'd have a good discussion. I saw some of your talks online as well, but it's fascinating stuff. And like I said, I have no background in neuroscience. My girlfriend's actually a neuroscientist, so maybe she's actually in Cambodia right now, but she got her PhD at Yale, and that's how we met. So she was in New Haven, I was in Brooklyn. We linked up through there, but maybe, since we've been dating, she's kind of planted the seed of neuroscience in my head, and I've become more interested in that. And it is, like I said, it's very interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at human behavior, it's very interesting. If you look at social behavior, if you want to know why, you look at extremes, right?
Yeah.
So we always look at extremes first. We look for kind of genetic correlates and brain correlates of this in Neanderthals and older hominids. So we study Neanderthals and hominids. So look at how the genes what's called gene introgression. How Neanderthals and humans kind of back and forth having sex. kind of sharing a gene
Yeah.
pool, and what that means to brain development, the parts of the brain, and how it impacts the development of the ideas, not only just of violence, but of religion, and looking forward in time and space. What are the genes that impact that? And what are the brain areas, the brain circuits that affect the looking forward in space and time? And so
Yeah.
we got another. So the guy who, Pavel, who runs that one project on Neanderthal, he just got the Nobel Prize for that work. We got another couple of papers we've
Wow.
submitted on this. So trying to understand this from that point of view, when did this stuff arise? When did the Garden of Good and Evil start? Not the Garden of Eden, but the Garden of Good and Evil. And they probably started at the same time.
Mm.
And so
So do you see, for someone like you who has violent people in their family history and it's multiple people, how much of that gets passed down in the gene pool over time? And if it is getting passed down genetically, how long does it take to wash out? Or is it just in there for a while?
it tends to wash out pretty quickly, by the breeding. One guy that I do a lot of work with, a psychiatrist, he was the one that discovered that when you marry or when you mate with somebody, what you're attracted to is somebody who's genetically identical, half identical, and half opposite, psychiatrically too. This is why certain people will be attracted to the other person. Half they appear to be identical behaviorally and genetically, and half they're completely different.
So according to that, if you're a psychopath and you're looking to marry someone, you would gravitate towards someone who wasn't psychopathic. Another do psychopaths turn other psychopaths off? Like how do two full-blown psychopaths interact with each other? Like what does
Usually
that
not
look
well.
like? Not well.
Not well. These are mating pairs. I just did a show. I just did a shoot here for a TV series on the children of serial killers. But talked about what's called transgenerational epigenetic effects. So things that jump generations, right? Something you get from your grandfather, great grandfather. That is, do those epigenetic marks on these genes from trauma, do they get passed? How many generations they get passed on? Well, for some things we know that they do, and especially for metabolism and also for addictions. So they do get passed on, and they do have to do with stress. So one thing that really got me interested in this is how to, prevent, is to study all the different neighborhoods around the world to compare the genetics and their murder rate and everything, and to see how much of it is genetic and epigenetic, and how much of it is due to that environment, constant environment of seeing, kids are brought up in neighborhoods where they're constantly seeing violence and they're bullied. I mean, this is, a key problem, I think, for extending this. And same thing with studying these dictators, the evolution, how war feeds on itself, why all those, and why what's happening in Ukraine is so awful. To me, is a bunch of kids getting epigenetically changed forever in their life, and then getting even. This is what's going on there from a neuroscience or neurobehavioral point of view, is this transgenerational epigenetic marking that's going on.
What do you find when you look at when you're doing these epigenetic studies? Do you find that there are more psychopaths concentrated in violent areas throughout history? Do you find that it's kind of equally dispersed throughout non-violent and violent areas?
That's a good question. I don't know, because in order to do the epigenetic studies, you have to have the brains. and we don't always
Mm,
get their brains. You
mm.
got to measure the RNA in the brain, which is RNA is not too stable, and so I don't know the answer to that. To me, it's the prediction is that why do people keep voting for tyrants? Why in Russia? Well, you got 500 years of czarist rule, and they're used to the abuse, right? And so they keep voting in
Mm.
Putins and czars and people who do that. So it keeps feeding on itself. That's why I think it's important. So I work with the military on stuff like this, and different corporations. But uh,
What does the military ask you to do? Is it more predictive analysis? What are they what how are they trying to leverage the study of violent
well, I was
psychopaths?
asked to be on our former Secretary of Defense, James Mattis. So I was
Mm,
on his committee. And the thing is, how do you test people who should not go into, who should not become part of the combat unit in the military?
mm,
What kind of tests can we do so we know we're not going to be creating people who are going to become sociopathic or psychopathic, or not picking people in who are that, and then to keep people to find out who is susceptible to PTSD and suicide. It's not just psychopathy. So it's discussion about that and how to show that. So I work with them to so I work with different parts of the military. I work with the military in Russia too,
W-
and Ukraine.
would having a certain amount of psychopaths on your side during a war be beneficial? Like,
Absolutely.
because yeah,
Yeah.
because I would think that if you have someone who can commit acts of violence and not feel remorse about it, and they were also willing to follow directions a little bit. I mean, maybe they're not doing everything by the book, but if they're given a mission, it seems like if that mission involved intense violence, you may want someone who could do that more easily and then could keep doing that and not necessarily deal with the aftermath of trauma in a way that someone else would with a more
Right. Yeah. I mean,
normal
if you
psyche.
look at some of the like psychopathy, you can see how it can help a species, right? With that, who's going to go over the hill and have sex with all the women on the other side of the mountain?
Mm,
Psychopaths are. Is that good for families? Is it good for the tribe? No. Is it good for the species? Yes. Mixing up genes is good for the species, makes for a robust species. So what's good and bad depends on the scale you're talking about. Psychopathic behavior is not good for families or interpersonal relationships or even, tribes. But for the species, it seems to be like a very helpful.
yeah, like at an individual level, at a familial level, I could see how having a psychopath in your family could wreak some havoc, especially if left unchecked, or you're in a country where the laws aren't as stringent or they allow for more violent acts to take place. But on a broad spectrum, having an army with psychopaths in it dispersed throughout, it almost seems like those could be, a sort of golden piece to call upon when you need someone to be able to commit
Yeah,
repetitive violent actions and not have to deal with traumatic unpacking of that experience. Like you could just keep going back
yeah.
and back again and
You
doing
see
the
how it could be
violent things.
a good thing, that is, or adaptive, not necessarily
Yeah.
good, but adaptive. Yeah.
So do you think that's why psychopaths have the psychopathic gene has not been washed out completely by evolution because we need people like
Well,
that
I
around?
think the genes that produce the behaviors in psychopathy are very useful in producing a very robust species, aggressive species that's going to win.
Hmm.
I mean, and poor Neanderthals,
Yeah.
and look what we did to them. Yeah. So I mean, it's for robust species, it's good in that sense.
Yeah, we're such a violent species, and if you think about it, we're the most violent species and a homicidal species to ever walk this earth. We've killed. I mean, there are different theories on what happened to different species of humans. One theory is that Homo sapiens encountered other species and just murdered them, wiped them out. There are other theories that say that we mated with them and then our genetically Homo sapiens took over. It was a combination of both, but especially in times like that where you're in a tribe of 50 to 150 people and you're just walking around like your entire life is lived within 100 square miles and you're basically just going from place to place, encountering other neighboring tribes, and your tribe's existence depends on you killing the other tribe. I could see how having people that are complete psychopaths would help you would pass down that gene and keep passing it down, especially in those hyper violent times. And then
Yeah, very
also
very
women
useful.
women that are seeing that, because like women who are nursing children, like the most vulnerable state in the world is a mother who has to nurse her child. And when you're talking about 50,000, 100,000 years ago, you need a guy who's going to go out there and just do whatever it takes to survive. So you might be drawn as a woman to a psychopath because they're going to provide you more protection. And so that
Yeah,
keeps the
a paper.
continuation of the gene being passed down.
Yeah, a paper that came out a couple of weeks ago that that suggests that is the key thing is the women choosing these kind of guys. That's what's been brought into our genome selectively. It's women choosing bad guys. It's going
And it's,
on right now.
yeah, do you think it's like some sort of leftover evolutionary survival instinct that
Yes.
women are choosing these bad guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's like the scientific explanation of the bad boy, maybe uh that notion that women always go after the quote unquote bad guys, bad boys, this this instinct to want someone to protect you at all costs, even when it comes to committing, insane acts of violence. And then it definitely seems like in places like America, at least, that selection process by women is getting less and less useful because we're living in a society where you go to jail for the rest of your life doing things like that. But there are other ways in which it could manifest. Like you could be in finance, you could be in politics, like guys who crave power, crave control. They don't have to go out and murder people anymore because we're not in this constant state of
They just have to
survival.
dominate them. Yeah, they
Yeah.
just have to win.
Yeah.
And that drive to win is certainly part of psychopathy and NPD, the drive to win and dominate.
Yeah.
And and certainly you can make the case what you're doing, which is that women are key to this. Is it's smelling the power, which then they can own, right?
Yeah. And if you connect the dots back to evolution, women were probably drawn to that. They were drawn to that same gene, but it expressed itself in different ways throughout history. You're a man being very powerful 100,000 years ago. You had to kill people to do that. But now, if you want to succeed and keep moving forward, that's not a great thing to do. You're not going to get
No,
away with that
it's
for very long.
not.
And then women have this leftover instinct to be attracted towards guys like that, but
Yeah,
it's coming from a very long time ago. That makes sense.
yeah.
So I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned early on in the conversation, where you said being in the room with a full blown psychopath, someone who's a serial killer, pedophile, they looked at you like you were a piece of meat.
They do. You have to. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what they try to do. And you got to look back at them the same way.
So you try to reflect the way that they're looking at you.
Yes. Yeah.
What does that do? How does that help you out?
Well, they don't want to die.
Yeah, they want to
They don't
survive.
want to. They don't want to. They don't want to die. They're looking for weak people. They're not looking for strong people. They're looking for somebody they can dominate. And if you're tough and you growl back and you're convincing, they leave you alone.
Is there a certain look in their eyes or body language, facial expression? Is there a giveaway for a full-blown psychopath? Is there a through line to all these guys that you met that's just something you could see or latch onto that tells you that you're dealing with a psychopath? Like a
Well, if you ever see
physical
a
expression?
predator, have you ever been around like a lion or some predatory animal? How
Have
they
I fortunately no. I mean, I've been around a few huge bucks like deer, but never a bear or a lion or anything like that.
I lived in Africa for a few times in South Africa and East Africa, and just in dealing with predators and how they lions and especially male, young male lions, and they have a look like you're a piece of meat, and you are, and and that's how these guys are.
So it's in the eyes. There's like some sort of is it like an empty look? Is it a hungry look? Like what is that thing, that vibe that you get that tells you that you're the prey?
Sort of the black eyes, the that there's no twinkle there really.
Mm.
There's no. It's not like I'm looking at you, and I look with a countenance, with a face that you understand that I recognize you as a human being,
Mm.
and and you reflect that and so you're reflecting with a certain bright-eyed look, as opposed to just the piece of meat look. They're very distinguishable.
And when a psychopath wants you to see that twinkle, when they want you to see them as someone who's more human and someone with a conscience, they're able to fake that? They're able to do that to manipulate people?
Completely, yeah. They're always reading your emotions. They're specific when you think that they're listening to you. That look at what a wonderful guy. He's actually listening to me. This is how women fall for it. It's not like the other guy. See,
Mm.
the guy I met, he really listens to me. All he's doing is reading what you're weak about and how he can use you.
So psychopaths
So it's
are good
always
listeners, but they're listening because they want to use that information to control you or manipulate you in some way. They're not
you got it.
listening. They're not listening out of a sense of empathy or how can I connect to this person to, you
Yeah.
know,
Whenever any of my female friends, I hear them say, "Well, he really listened to me." I said, "That's a warning sign. Uh, It's not so great."
I'm gonna start using that as an excuse to my girlfriend when she says you're not when my girlfriend says you're not listening to me, I'll say, good, that means I'm not a psychopath.
Well,
You should be
that's
you
what's
should be
really
grateful.
what's a nice guy. What's a good guy, a nice guy, but no, they're very good at hiding that whole thing, and seeming to really care about you. That's part of that's the come on.
You mentioned the drive for manipulation in the book, that you share the manipulation social aspect of psychopaths, but you don't have the violence aspect of it. Violence has never seemed appealing to you. Can you talk a little bit about the drive you feel to manipulate. You've said that you get a buzz off of people opening up to you. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you've used that and experienced that in your life?
Yeah, I mean, just having people. I'm a professor. I teach. I like people who really listen. It's like, oh, that's really interesting, right? It's kind of, I think, like an ego buzz. Like what you're saying is so interesting. That's kind of addicting. And so I think I fall prey to that. And that's kind of owning somebody by being interesting enough and telling stories that are true, that are interesting and true. And that's a way to not, I've never tried to use it to get money or sex from people, but nonetheless, the fundamental idea of it, I think I get. My wife recognizes when I do it, and she doesn't like it. Not to her,
Yeah.
but with other people.
So she can see the wheels of manipulation turning.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, she does not think she does not appreciate it at all when she sees me doing that.
So
Definitely.
so what's like how can she tell? What's the difference between a lively conversation and a manipulative one to her? Like what is she seeing in you that makes it more manipulative than just a great conversation?
Well, she's very perceptive. She can smell a rat a mile away. I mean, she really is. And so, not that she thinks I'm a rat, but she doesn't like that behavior. So I think she's tuned into it.
So it's more of
Somebody who's
a
trying to be so.
it's more of a sixth sense, like and it's to someone else besides your wife. It just looks like you're in an intense conversation, or you're just
It's an
listening to someone.
intense, enjoyable, interesting
Yeah,
conversation. That's what it looks like. To
and
her, it looks like I'm just like being a con, just conning people,
mm,
and she doesn't like it. But she'll when people try it with her, she'll blow them off. She can really. It's not just when I do it. She doesn't like when anybody does it. She's a
has she
con artist.
has she ever turned to you and said, that guy's a psychopath based on her conversation because she's had
And
experience?
in so many words, basically, like
Yeah,
that guy's a manipulative prick. Yeah, I mean, in so many words.
yeah.
She uses more colorful language than just the clinical term.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's also what makes the book so captivating to go through is that it just sounds like someone talking. It's not just doesn't read like a scientific paper. You mix in the science with your own language.
Look, I tried to do that. Thanks
Yeah,
for noticing, Zach.
yeah. So to go back to you mentioned the black eyes. I've heard other people talk about guys like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer. You hear that notion come up over and over again where I talked to this guy and there was some sort of blackness in his eyes. And it's usually a state where it's in an interview, they're not really worried about coming off as someone who's agreeable or someone, they're not really trying to, I guess they're not trying to do anything in that interview other than just, manipulate the person in front of them. I guess their guard is a little bit down. And so the blackness in their eyes comes out. Is there a biological reason for that? The blackness, like something observable that's happening in the biology of a psychopath's body, or do we not fully understand the visual
Not that I
cues?
know of. I trained with a guy, a pediatric neurologist, who told me back in the '70s when I was working with him, he, he had analyzed a lot of kids when they were very young and followed them through to their adulthood, and he told me that he could see a developing psychopath and a kid as young as 2 or 3 years old. He says he knew
Wow.
when they were going to be. They had that look on their face. They look right through you like you don't exist.
Yeah, I, I've experienced that maybe once. Like I've been in a situation with a guy where, and this is long before I read about psychopaths, but just like kind of felt some sort of darkness there and emptiness. And I've heard other people talk about that same sort of vibe, but being on psychedelics while meeting a psychopath. Like I've heard stories of people that take mushrooms. I've heard stories of people that take mushrooms. They go to a party and everything's happy, jovial, and then all of a sudden they meet a guy, and for whatever reason, the mushrooms enhance the darkness of that guy who may or may not be a psychopath, but something about psychedelics seems to open up the identification of people like that. Like I'd be curious to see. I'd be curious to see if there's like any study of, does being on psychedelics enhance your perception of psychopaths?
Well, a really terrific movie that goes through this a bit, not so much scientifically but experientially, is Jacob's Ladder.
Jacob's Ladder. I haven't seen it.
With the black eyes and the psychopathic behavior. Jacob's Ladder is a great film that deals with this. That's highly recommended.
What is it about? Because I don't think I've seen Jacob's Ladder. I'm gonna write it down though to check it out.
Yeah, you should, because it overlaps with this discussion, definitely. It has to do in part with the MK Ultra stuff with the psychedelics and the Vietnam War, and a lot of it takes place in New York City. It has to do with these black eyes and seeing this. Yeah, I mean,
Jacob's Ladder.
Jacob's Ladder.
Do you have a favorite high profile serial killer that you've studied, like a Bundy or a Dahmer, someone like that just for whatever reason stands out to you?
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan.
Let's see who stands out. I think Dahmer does. He wasn't a psychopath. He had a borderline personality disorder.
What did you see the series, the Netflix series that just came out?
Yeah, and I did a show on it too, so I had to go through all that, and yeah.
What did you think about the Netflix series on Dahmer compared to what you know about the actual Dahmer?
Well, they wanted to make him a psychopath. He doesn't come across as a psychopath. He really comes across as borderline.
He comes across as borderline in the series?
Borderline personality disorder.
Okay. But in real life, he was more of a psychopath than borderline.
No, I think in real life he was more a borderline.
Real life he was borderline, and in the series he's borderline.
Yeah, in the series they wanted to make him a psychopath. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually I finished the first episode, and I got halfway through the second episode, and I don't know what it was about this series. It might have been I don't know. I one of my favorite TV series of all time is Hannibal on Amazon Prime. So I am used to eating dinner and also watching something violent, and I can eat and it doesn't bother me. Like I'm it's just like something that's happening on the screen. It's so well written. It's interesting, and there's also incredibly violent scenes in Hannibal, and the climax of the entire series is the most violent thing that I've seen on TV. And I was fine watching that, but there was something about the tenseness in Dahmer and the buildup and just having the series, having the entire first episode just focus on the in the moment, extremely tense, uh, just that whole Dahmer in the bedroom with this guy, kind of
Yeah.
just watching and waiting, and the suspense is just building, and you know what's going to happen, but I don't know. Maybe that's what got to me. Just the eeriness of nothing happening, as opposed to a show like Hannibal, where it is violent, that it is eerie, but there's not as much uh there's not as much hanging depravity. I don't know how to describe it. There's a lot of just long moments of uncomfortability and Dahmer that got to me.
Anticipation is more intense than actual emotional experiences.
Yeah. I mean, that checks out with my response to it.
We did experiments on this, the anticipation of unbearable pain. We took men and women and to see what they could handle, and put balloons up their ass and blew up the balloons until they couldn't stand it anymore.
Oh my God.
And then did PET scans to see looked at their threshold and their brain patterns, and we wanted to compare men and women. And then we just told them the next week when they came in, we're going to blow it up even more. And that's what got them. It's the anticipation of the coming pain and that emotion. That's what really turned the brains on
How many?
and freaked them out.
So I've many questions to that. How many people came back the next week when you told them you were going to blow it up more? And does being gay affect the way that people responded to that experiment?
We thought the women would be able to take that more than the men could. That is the threshold for the pain, because women, from the time they're young, they're more used to being sort of tested, right? And so there's not as much of that was our idea. It turned out not to be true, and so but also the anticipation. The women were much more bothered by and tuned into, and you can see it in their brain patterns, by the anticipation of where this pain was going. But they all came back.
Mm. So the
It
men,
wasn't so
the
much.
men were
It
able
wasn't
to
so
take
much that
more.
the pain. It wasn't so much the pain of the experiment was bad. What was bad to them was the anticipation of the next one. But
So
we never.
so the men were able to take more physical pain. And what about the anticipation? Was that equal across the board with men and women?
The men were able to take the pain itself better. That is, their threshold was higher.
Mm.
The anticipation affected the women more
Mm.
too.
Yeah, I mean, did people knew what they were signing up for? Like, was it a surprise when they got there? How did you announce this experiment? I'm curious to
Well,
I would think, yeah.
the two women who created the experiment, who really ran it, they very carefully went through, and so the people coming in knew that it was more of a psychological experiment about anticipation.
Mm.
They knew that, and that helped.
So they knew it was a psychological experiment about anticipation, but they did not know they'd be getting balloons blown up their ass until they got there.
No, they knew there were balloons up the ass.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. I'm trying to think how much I'd have to get paid to be part of that experiment. That's a wild one.
You have to pay. Yeah, you have to pay pretty well.
Yeah.
Because there's no way of sugarcoating that in the explanation,
No, yeah. I mean, getting balloons blown up your ass, you know, that did, I mean, yeah, that it's I have nothing to compare it to. It's like I'm trying to imagine being in that scenario. I guess I'll eventually get it when I get a prostate exam. I know you got to
Yeah,
get
the
like a
prostate. Yeah,
finger
it's not like
stuck up your
a
ass.
prostate.
I'm trying to imagine I walk into a lab and I'm bending over a table, the gloves snap, and I get a balloon stuck up my ass, and someone's just like pumping the balloon until I can't take it. At what point am I like, this $200 was nowhere close to worth
Not
it?
worth it. But actually, it's not the actual pain wasn't that bad. Like I was saying, the
Yeah,
anticipation is what bothers people,
yeah,
which was the basis of your point.
yeah, yeah. That's tough. To go back to Dahmer, he's he's a serial killer that fits more into the borderline personality profile. What makes that profile different than had Dahmer been a psychopathic murder? Like, it was Ted Bundy a psychopath, or was he borderline?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't really know, but I don't think so. Looking at his traits, that whole thing is if you leave me, I can't stand it because borderlines can't stand to be, their fear is abandonment.
Mm,
That's their fear. And when they really think you're going to leave, that's when they kill you. And that's why they can eat you too, make you part of them. It's the cannibal part. But for borderlines, they you can't. If you leave, you become the devil, and you deserve to die. See, borderlines can be dangerous.
so is there a famous serial killer or more infamous serial killer that comes to mind that also fits the mold of a psychopath?
Oh, Ted Bundy
So Ted Bundy
and
was more
and,
of a
and
psychopath.
Charles Manson.
Okay. So those guys are more on the psychopath spectrum, and
Yes,
then a Dahmer would be more of the borderline spectrum.
yes.
That so what do you see? Is there anything interesting you see in the brain scans of guys that are serial killing psychopaths, the dialogue that they've had, the interviews that you've had, just anything interesting that is part of being pushed over the edge to commit violent acts? Because there's a lot of psychopaths out there, only a few become violent and end up becoming serial killers and
Right.
causing destructive harm. Is there anything just like anything interesting about the way that their brain works, the scans, that the things that they've said to you that sticks out, that is indicative of that separation towards full blown violence?
No, not really. What's that ultimate trigger? Right? Is the question. No, I don't know.
So it's
It's a great question.
more of a combination of things. There's you can't just it's not just one thing. It's just an entire spectrum, gradual build up.
Yeah, and it's situational too,
Hmm.
right? There, a lot of it is, half of it is just being an opportunistic parasite, and then you're in the moment, and in that moment you have a chance to release all this. These psychopaths, they don't feel pleasure easily. They have to do such extreme things to feel any sort of release or pleasure.
Mm.
The amount of enjoyment and relaxation you get from drinking your tea or coffee, for them to reach they've that mild amount of release and pleasure. I mean, they got to spend a weekend in Vegas with a couple of prostitutes and cocaine and everything, just to tweak that. There's so much, frustrated. There's no pleasure. They're just numb. And so just to reach that threshold of, I can get there. I know I can get there. It's like, why do you shoot up? Why do you shoot up a drug? Why do because at that moment you're in
Mm.
control. You have the free will to release the Kraken, and so it's like, and you can do that. So that's power.
So a non-violent psychopath would be a good party companion, someone who knows how to have a good time.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I know you described some escapades in the book. Do you have an all-time party night or a bender that comes to mind where you just went balls to the wall with a group of friends?
Yeah. I still have children and grandchildren and nieces and everything. So I got to watch what I say. But certainly, yeah, I mean, I know how to party.
Yeah.
I'm an old man now. What can I do? I can't do anything. But yeah, you're talking about the past. Yeah, I had some friends who were worried about the book that I would put some of our escapades together in there because they're professional people. Really worried. I mean,
Yeah.
just freaked out, and I didn't out them.
Yeah. Is there one that comes to mind that you would feel comfortable saying? One of those escapades, occasions that you could describe?
Well, one that I put in there that was a lot of fun was up at that fraternity house, just tearing that place apart up in L.A.
Mm.
And that's an escapade in the book. That was a lot of fun. The cops even enjoyed that one. They loved it.
Yeah, remind me of that one again. That was a college night?
That was a postdoc. It was after college.
Postdoc, okay.
After my doctorate, yeah. Uh, After a football game up in L.A. Just going around from fraternity house to fraternity house, just busting it up and having a great time.
And so do you feel like your friends would gravitate towards you in those party situations? They knew that you would be a guy who wants to have a good time,
I
and
could transport them there, yes.
yeah. Do you feel
Yep.
like you share that tendency of needing the bigger hit to feel pleasure? Do you share that same trait?
Yeah, probably. People that know me would say that's
Yeah.
definitely true. I need a lot of stimulation. And most of what I do is thrill seeking.
Has that
It was easier when I was young because I could,
yeah.
I was playing football and downhill skiing and racing and everything, and getting those kinds of buzzes. As I got older, I couldn't do that, so I had to do other things.
So how do you deal with that now that you're not going to Vegas on random weekends? How do you feel like you hit that pleasure center as a 75-year-old neuroscientist?
Well, you can dream. I have memories.
Relive the memories.
Yeah, I mean, the memories are great.
Yeah.
I can dream and I have memories. And those are always fun to relive and talk about.
Well, as a neuroscientist, what do you think about the potential technology of something like Neuralink, where you could store a memory bank and then relive a memory as if it's happening right now? Do you think that'll be possible in the future? Is that all bullshit? Like the science and the technology behind being able to relive past experiences?
But I think we have. Well, I mean, REM sleep is a real life hallucination, isn't it?
Is that what
Yeah,
it
I
is?
mean, yeah, I mean, it's a real life hallucination. We've done a lot of REM sleep studies with PET scanning and other things to show that REM sleep is not so much a rehashing of what happened today, but prediction of what's going to happen tomorrow. It's a prediction of tomorrow, and I mean, I enjoy. I have lots of lucid dreams, which I just love. I just love those. Very vivid and lucid. So I get off on dreaming, I think, now to directly answer your question.
So, I mean, that's a good place to get off because you could do with it whatever you want with little to no
Oh
consequences.
yeah,
And lucid dreams, those are the ones where you realize you're dreaming in the moment. You're aware that you're
yes,
dreaming.
yeah, yes,
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever had a lucid dream. I've had sleep paralysis where I'm in that in between state, and I've
yeah,
being attacked by wolves and stuff, and I'm paralyzed in my bed. But
yeah.
I don't know if I've ever had a lucid dream where I realize I'm dreaming and I'm still dreaming. I feel like as soon as I realize I'm dreaming, it's like a finger snap, and I always wake up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's you know, there's a book written by Salvador Dali that's great to get you into that state, into the highly creative state in between wakefulness and dreaming. It's and it's 50 Salvador Dali, and it's like 50 techniques to the creative act or something. That's one of the great bathroom books. Salvador Dali. He had all these tricks where he would
Mm,
get himself into these creative moments, and he knew how to manipulate him going in and out of the early sleep state.
mm. And you could use these tricks to practice getting into a more lucid dreaming state.
I think yes, I think so.
Mm. Do you do anything to get into a lucid dreaming state, or have you always had those types of dreams from an early age?
I think I've had them since I was my first memories are of lucid dreams.
Really?
Yeah.
So,
But I would every night I would go to sleep. As I was going to sleep, I would have this sort of this light, this blue white light that would get in front of my forehead, and it would shimmer, and then it would start to contract into this very bright, extremely bright blue white light that would come and hit me right between the eyes, and it would go ping. It actually went ping, and it felt like something that was infinitely heavy but infinitesimally small at the same time. That was a dream I had as a toddler, and I can still conjure that up. It's a very pleasant thing.
and that pinging, that blue light that was approaching your forehead, that would happen as you were falling asleep, like right before.
Yes, as I was going under, but I can get there. I go out into my jacuzzi and just sit out in my jacuzzi. I get the same thing.
What do you think that is? Like, is it? I mean, it sounds kind of like bullshit to say, but if you're experiencing some sort of energy that seems, because it seems like it's something going into you, it's external and it's going into you somehow. I have no idea what it is, but is there some sort of connection that you suspect we may share that where we can go visit that in a dream state, like people can
Oh,
tap into like
yeah,
a connectivity?
that one I practiced a lot, which is to get into that state, and then what happens is kind of a tube forms. This tube that I can get into, and I remember I got tested for a long time down, but Reginald Bickford, who was studying all these yogis on meditation, and so this is when I was at UCSD, and so I put me in kind of an isolation tank, and they asked me to be involved because they were bringing in all these meditators, and the guy was running it. Since I was a smoker and a drinker and a partier, I was like the opposite of a meditator. So they wanted to use me as like
You
a
meditate,
negative control.
you find presence in life instead of on a pillow.
Yeah, right. It's well put. But when I, but after I had that done, that had all my EEGs on the wall, so I talked to the guy who studied for years all of meditation. He goes, every time you blink, close your eyes or blink. He says you go into a deep meditation. So he says you're a naturally meditative person, which I don't know how to meditate. He told me. I said, look, I'm not a meditator. He says, whenever you blink, your eyes go, he says, you're gone. He says, you're completely gone. And so that was interesting. So he thought after, and the people work with him, talking with him after, that it must be a sort of a genetic thing or something that's pre-wired because it's so naturally go into it.
Is this connected in any way to the kooky spiritual perceptions you were mentioning before?
Yes. Yeah, it's connected.
What do you think? What do you think that is? Is putting the strict neuroscience away for a second? Like, if you had to guess what you think that thing is, that the blue light, the meditative state that seems pretty constant with you. What do you think that could be?
I think a lot of people have this, and I think it's probably been around thousands of years, and that from that people evinced or said, look this is different than this other reality, and therefore, and that became a sense of spirituality. So I just see it as probably something that a lot of people have, and you have to put a name to it. And so you call it spiritual, but I don't think for me, it's not spiritual, but I can see how it seems like that. It seems because I can really kind of leave my body in that sense, really just float around. And
so you feel like you can actually leave your body in those moments, like you're
completely.
Watching yourself.
Yeah, definitely, most definitely.
Is this during the day? Is this during sleep? Like when do you have these feelings out of body?
I can do it at night in sleep, but I can do it now. I can't do it now talking to you, but if I laid down and just relaxed, I could get there pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It's a great sensation.
I've heard people talk about that with psychedelics where you can get into a state where, and I've heard it with deep meditation too, where you have an out of body experience and you essentially feel like you're watching yourself. You're looking at yourself experience life. And in psychedelics, that's amplified to include other distortions of reality, sights, sounds, things like that. But for you to be able to tap into it so easily and do it seemingly on command, that's pretty wild, because people spend their whole lives trying to get into states like that, trying to be able to have out of body experiences or get into meditative states. The fact that you can do that with just blinking or lying down, going in a jacuzzi, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's a very handy thing. It's just so pleasurable. But I just feel like I'm flying, right? But I'm not. There's no drugs or anything, and it's the same feeling I had when I was just a kid in the crib. It was, it's the same thing.
So you mentioned that REM sleep can be a predictor for the next day. Do you feel like when you get in these states, you can perceive things that haven't happened yet?
It seems that way sometimes.
Do you have an example of a time where you could point to, even if it's not a definitive connection, like something where you saw it when you were in that state and then it happened and there could be some sort of connection there?
I love going to the races, right? I love horses,
Mm-hmm.
horse racing. And here's an example. And so I spent many years at Saratoga. My father did it, my brothers do it and everything, all that stuff. And also at Belmont, but mostly Saratoga and out here in Del Mar. And I remember we were going to put a big bet together. And so on a Tuesday, I went to sleep and I was flying. I was really having a wonderful lucid and vivid and lucid dream. And I saw a race take place. It was the 11th race, and this horse came out and ended up breaking his leg and dying. And another horse, a long shot, came in and won the race. And I had all the numbers in my head. And I called up my brothers and I said, we got to put a big bet down. I said, I just had this dream. I said, but it didn't make any sense because the 11th race, what's this? And it wasn't until that Friday that I realized it was the Preakness, and where there were 11 races, and so we ended up putting a big bet down on the horse that won. That was the long shot, and in fact, the one horse did break his leg and ended up dying. It was a traumatic. It turned out to be sort of a traumatic dream in the end because the horse died. You know, I love horses, but the whole thing was kind of not fun. You know, we made some good money though. But that would be an example of I saw that whole race in a dream, the whole thing. And you know, I think people have these experiences, but you rarely get to make money off them. You know, it's like a
Yeah, but I mean, the sure it could be used to make money. You know, maybe you place a bet, win the lottery, know the combo to a bank vault, something like that. But just like that is so specific that coincidence that coincidence seems almost impossible. It's not completely impossible, but the fact that you had a premonition about a horse breaking its leg and then visualize the horse that won that race and then it actually happened after the dream, that people hear that. And sometimes I'm guilty of this. I hear that and I just want to put that in the box. That's crazy. That can never happen.
Yeah,
that's bullshit, blah,
bullshit,
blah, blah.
yeah.
But then there's also the side of it of what if this is something that's happening that maybe 100 or 1,000 years from now, we can neurochemically understand and say, this is what's happening in someone's brain. This is the root cause of it. We can map the genetics of people that have this ability. But now it seems insane. Like if you believed that there was some sort of premonition perception that people can dream things that happen later on. It seems insane, but it does happen. People report having very specific dreams like yourself, and then almost the same exact dream happens later on. And maybe there is some sort of connection to REM sleep where, I don't know, some aspect of reality is being compressed through your dreams from the future into the present, and you're somehow able to pick up on that, and maybe you have some sort of genetic antenna that allows you to receive information that other people don't.
Dean Radin published a short paper, extended abstract, where he was looking at people. He's probably the most famous ESP guy on the planet, right? He and Ed May, and he found a gene sequence that was more enriched in people with these high ESP scores, these high psi scores. So that's Dean Radin. But I just can't see how it can happen. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Face validity is kind of tough on that one. But if you look, there are people that do this stuff. How they do it, I mean, it seems quite impossible.
Have you seen a connection with psychopathy and premonitions of other psychopaths or people that fit the traits of psychopaths vocalize that experience?
Psychiatrists who treat people with psychopathy say there is.
So there's a widespread premonition among psychopaths, or seems that there could be
higher rates of precognition. Yes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, who knows what it is yet, but that it's there. Whatever it is, like something is there, and it deserves to be recorded at the least, just recorded and possibly, maybe we have the tools to narrow it down later on, like what is the actual neurochemical process occurring, or if it's
Yeah,
something
I mean,
outside neurochemistry.
Dean Radin he's tested hundreds of thousands of people worldwide on a website called GotPsy,
Got psi.
GOTPSI, ESP, GotPsy. That's Dean Radin's a website, and he does all sorts of experiments on this. I can't see how it can work, but the statistics say it does, and that some
Mm.
people can do it well. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite depiction of psychopaths in film or TV? Something from the media that a guy that you particularly like, or woman?
Um, No Country for Old Men. I think
Yeah.
that's a great portrayal, but the original Hannibal Lecter was the most
Mm.
believable to me. And I remember when we were young, my wife and I watched it, and she goes, "That's you."
Yeah.
I said, "What? What's me?" She goes, "He's just like you." I said, "Who's just like me?" Well, she was talking about Will, the cop, who has these drives of psychopathy, but he's fundamentally a nice guy. So she was talking about, but that portrayal, that particular one, is the most convincing to me.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen the Amazon Prime series, but the Hannibal Amazon Prime series has the back and forth of Dr. Hannibal Lecter and Will the cop, and the intertwining of both of their stories is fascinating in the way that you said, like there's an element of depravity in both of them. Will thinks he's
Yeah,
tracking psychopathic killers and ultimately meets face to face with Hannibal, but at the same time, Will crosses over in a lot of the same traits that Hannibal has. They're very different, and they express they express things very differently. Hannibal is extremely violent. Will is more uh, Will is not violent, but he's also very calculating and manipulative, and
yeah.
also he
He's a
also
he's a
has this
pro.
sense of premonition. He has dreams. He has
Yes, yeah,
the premonition trait in the show, so it's
yeah.
very
I
interesting.
haven't seen the show. I probably should, but yeah,
Yeah,
he's a pro-social type.
yeah. I'm just gonna take a bathroom break real quick, and I'll be right back. We could wrap up. So I imagine a lot of people who are listening to this podcast will want to know how they should act around a psychopath if they suspect that they're in the presence of a psychopath. And, they're not, it's not their job to interview and study psychopaths. They're out at a bar or something, house party, in the office, and they are dealing with someone who's off. How should someone act around someone who they suspect to be at least sharing some of the traits of a psychopath, if not a full blown psychopath?
Yeah, a walk away.
What if you can't walk away? What if you're working with someone? This person's in your office. They're in the same social circle, and you see them on a regular, semi-regular basis.
You try to avoid them. You can't let them into your head. They want to be in your head
They want to get to you so they can manipulate.
in some way,
Hmm.
to the point that you're going to be uncomfortable.
So if you think back to the times where you were actively manipulating someone, what is it more of like you're kind of scanning their personal experiences and the dialogue for an in? Do you come in with a preconceived game plan of how you're going to
No,
manipulate this
I,
person?
I, I personally don't try to do it. I try to
O-
fight that.
Okay.
Definitely now I fight it. I try to completely fight any desire to do that. I don't like it in myself, and so I just I'll just inhibit it. I don't do it anymore.
In the past, when you have done it, is there just like speaking about ways that people could be on guard for this? Before you developed the avoidance of manipulation. If you think back to times where you manipulated people in the past through conversation, was it more of a scanning, like you were scanning for things to dig into? Did you come into the conversation with a plan in mind? Like how did that typically go down, the
No,
manipulation
I
tactics?
never did. I never had a plan. It would just happen organically. Or
Hmm.
if somebody was interesting, I would just be asking questions about them, and about their relationships and what they like and don't like, and just try to read what they were about,
Hmm.
and then echo that back to them.
Hmm.
So,
And just
and and sometimes I say, well,
yeah.
it seems that you've known me my whole life. How could you know that?
Hmm.
And so I'm looking for what personality types they are and trying to read that, and then I can do that pretty well.
As a person who as a person who shares psychopathic traits, how do you experience love? Like when you say that you love your wife and you love your kids, how do you personally experience that emotion?
Well, I definitely love them. I would, but people I know who I would, who I love and like, they would say that I'm kind of cold. It's just not believable.
But there is a love there. You feel
Yeah, I
you
think so.
feel
Yeah.
like a warmth, and you feel a sensation of I care for this person. I would, undergo intense amounts of harm to protect this person's life. You feel
I don't
that
know about
connection
that. Well, yeah, I mean,
for your wife, like for your wife and kids.
wife and kids are great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my my family, sure. Yeah, I feel very tight to them.
So other
Just
people
that.
may perceive it as cold and calculating, but you feel it internally. Like even if it looks cold to a bystander, you're you're feeling
Yes,
a warmth of love.
yes.
Well, I loved this conversation, so um, I think that's a great place to end off. And thank you
Okay.
again, thank you again so much, Dr. Fallon. You've given me too much of your time. And again, people should go check out The Psychopath Inside, a neuroscientist's personal journey into the dark side of the brain by James Fallon. If any part of this conversation interested you, you're definitely going to want to dive deeper into the book. And like I said, you know, I'm scientifically dumb. My girlfriend reminds me of that all the time. And this book, the science in this book, I was able to fully dig into and understand and be captivated by it. And there's a lot of stories to bridge the gap between the scientific understanding. So I definitely recommend checking out this book.
Yeah,
It is,
appreciate you saying that, Zach.
of course,
Thanks.
of course. Is there anything else that you want to direct people towards? I can link it into the podcast besides the book.
They can go on Google. I've done a bunch of things. I did an interview about Putin and other people. Um, I got a couple of shows come out. I just did some CNN stuff, but now I'm going to be on Nancy Grace about these children of serial killers. So that film crew was just here. So that'll be coming up on Nancy Grace.
Perhaps we'll go into Putin in round 2. We'll see what happens with the current situation, and I mean that's a whole nother 3-hour podcast right there. But thank you again so much, Dr. Fallon. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me too, Zach. Thanks.